Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome back to Andy's Book Club. So this week we're continuing on our coverage of The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, and we're covering chapter 6, which is a case study on this brand of shoes called Airwalks. Without further ado, let's jump in. Airwalks was a famous brand of shoes that appealed to kind of the skateboarding crowd. The whole point of this example was that the author Gladwell wanted to illustrate was that there's within any kind of system or any type of product or trend, there's early adopters and there's early majorities and late majorities. So the majority does not want to adapt new things, right? Usually the majority waits till other people have already adopted something, and then they jump in at a later time. These are typically the people that are rather, I want to say, resistant to change, or they don't like change. There's like the vast majority of people are people that are resistant to change, as I'm sure you can already tell, right? So think of any new product. It takes a while before a new product takes off, but there are also a small group of people that are early adopters. And these are the people that really want to try new things and are willing to try new things if it offers them some benefit or some advantage that other products are not able to. So this is kind of how Airwalks succeeded, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on in the chapter. But first, the author Gladwell talks about examples of how an idea spreads. So throughout the past, 3 or 4 chapters, we've talked about how ideas spread like an epidemic. And before that, we talked about market mavens and connectors and all these people that kind of help a message spread like an epidemic, like a virus. An example of this would be months before the end of World War II in the United States, when everyone was kind of on edge. There was a rumor that a Japanese spy had been spotted in Maine. But in fact, it was actually a Chinese scholar that was hired by a university in Maine. He was just sightseeing. He had a guidebook with him, and people thought that he was recording down notes to send back to the Japanese Imperial Army. This is an example of how a seemingly harmless situation, or when in fact it was a seemingly harmless story, just got spun out of proportion. The job of the market mavens and the connectors is to make a story more spreadable. So this is an example of how some people, a small group of people, maybe picked up on this story, and then they sharpened it and distorted it. So they sharpened it by making, let's say, the guidebook into a clipboard that was recording top secret information, and then they distorted the story to be like, oh, it's an Asian man, so he must be a Japanese spy, even though it's not confirmed that he was Japanese, and in fact he wasn't. He was Chinese, which is totally different. But people see an Asian person and they're like, oh, it must be they must be from one race. But that's an example of how a story got spun out of proportion. It doesn't have to be a negative example. It could be the role of market mavens and connectors is to spread stories. So it could be a positive story. It could be a product, right? So for example, we'll circle back to Airwalks in a second. But Airwalks is another example where a story or an idea or a trend spread really rapidly like an epidemic. But first, let's spend a moment and talk about the needle exchange program in Baltimore. Apparently Baltimore had a pretty bad drug abuse problem, and I'm not sure if it still does, but in this example, Baltimore was suffering from an epidemic of drug abuse. And the point is that when people do drugs, sometimes they share needles because they don't have any other choice. It's just they're looking for a quick fix, and there's no clean needles around. But when you share needles, it spreads diseases like HIV/AIDS and STDs and bloodborne diseases and stuff like that. The city, to tackle the spread of diseases and stuff like that, and to tackle just a general health crisis, people in the government were like, okay, well, we don't recommend you do drugs, but if you are going to do drugs, then we're going to take your dirty needles and exchange them for clean needles and give you clean needles. So at least if you're doing drugs, you can like not get an STD. So this is kind of the idea behind the needle exchange program. But what they found was that there are certain people that would kind of like be the wholesale dealers of clean needles. So they would gather up all the clean needles, and then they would be the ones that are distributing them among the neighborhood. And then if you give them pay, like if you pay them a little bit of money, they're happy to do that. And by hiring these people and enlisting the help of these people, it's actually a lot better in terms of getting the clean needles into the hands of the people who are injecting the drugs. And the reason for that, of course, is that these needle super exchangers, as they're called in the book, they're the connectors and the mavens, right? So they know, they're street savvy, they know like a lot of people who are in the drug world, and they know the people that are using the drugs. So it's a great way for the government to directly kind of interact with the people that are using the drugs, is by going through these super exchangers and enlisting their help. Again, it's very sad that people are abusing drugs, but at the same time, I think we got to be understanding that giving them clean needles is at least a start in helping them, because you're preventing them from getting STDs and like HIV/AIDS and stuff like that, right? So next up, we're gonna circle back to Airwalks and talk about why they're so successful. So they're so successful because they hired this ad agency called Lambasis. I'm terrible with names, so probably pronounced that incorrectly. But this marketing agency was very good at picking up social trends and making the product appeal to the innovators or the early adopters. So the early adopters are the people, as I said before, earlier in this video. The early adopters are kind of like market mavens and connectors. They're like the people that are really in tune with the space and they're really passionate about the space. So if you appeal to those, then they'll naturally spread that idea among other people who might be a little bit less passionate. But then the majority of people who are at least paying a little bit of attention, they might see someone in this space being like, hey, look at my new Airwalks, they're so cool. And that helps an idea spread. Airwalks, though, they started to lose their market dominance eventually when it changed up its strategy in a way that appealed to more mainstream and less to the early adopters and innovators, right? And we see this happen actually all the time in products where a company kind of loses its way, right? Can you think of another company that kind of lost its way? I don't know. Some people used to think of Apple as a hipster company, and now Apple is really mainstream. Although I wouldn't say Apple has lost its way. Apple is like more popular than ever before. But there are examples of like so many different companies that used to be so good, and then when they appealed to like a small group of people, when they were like kind of a hipster company, but then now they've just tried to like mainstream appeal, and then it just doesn't work and people just lose interest. I don't know. The company, I think OnePlus is an example of a company like that. I think for me, OnePlus is a company that makes phones, right? So it used to be that OnePlus appealed to like a very enthusiast demographic of smartphone users, of Android users. So if you didn't want an iPhone, then you could choose between a OnePlus, which is a lot cheaper than a Samsung, and it does like 99% of the same things. But recently, at least I've heard, I haven't used a OnePlus device like ever in my life, but at least that's one I've been paying attention to at least. But recently I heard that people don't like OnePlus anymore because they raise their prices and their features aren't really unique anymore, and they don't have any special features that differentiate them from their competitors, right? So just an example that I came up off the top of my head. You may agree or disagree, but that's just my opinion. But yeah, the question of the day though is, what's an example of a company in your mind that kind of tried to appeal to the mainstream too much and lost their way. So that's pretty much it for this chapter. And next chapter, chapter 7, we're going to do another case study. And then we're going to be wrapping up this book in the conclusion and the afterwards. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.